Our next excavation also takes place on Salisbury Plain, just 5 miles away from Stonehenge. But the story it's revealing is very different and took place just 100 years ago. 2016 was the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest battle in the history of the British Army, with 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. Those that led the campaign have been widely criticised for the way the battle was fought, for the inexperience and inadequate training of the soldiers. But does archaeology support that perception that the young men of Britain were sent to the Western Front like lambs to the slaughter? Salisbury Plain, covering an area the size of the Isle of Wight. For over 100 years, it's been the site of Britain's largest military training ground. During World War I, thousands of soldiers came here in preparation for fighting in the trenches of northern France. However, it's often thought that this training was too short and inadequate. Incredibly, a map has been uncovered in the National Archive that might change this perception once and for all. It suggests that the army was at least planning to recreate German trenches of the Western Front in these fields, so our soldiers could rehearse attacks on them. But were those trenches ever actually dug and used for training? Military archaeologist Richard Osgood has come to investigate.
To get a map of where they've sited these practice trenches is really unusual. You've got individual notifications on the map, so an S is a shelter. MG, you might have guessed, is a machine gun position. To get all that together is really a huge opportunity. But nonetheless, the map tells you about what they're meant to do. It doesn't tell you what actually does happen. Maybe this map was schematic, maybe it's not what's dug. Our job here over the next couple of weeks is really to see what's left under the ground, and the ideal would be to get architecture from trenches and evidence for the lives of the people that were here 100 years ago.
Trench warfare dominated World War I. With the invention of new powerful weapons such as massed artillery bombardments and rapid-firing machine guns, soldiers were forced to dig trenches to hide in for protection. Soldiers could live in these trenches for weeks at a time before being ordered to go over the top and charge at the enemy. If Richard can prove that extensive German trench fortifications were recreated on Salisbury Plain, it's proof that the soldiers sent here received comprehensive training in attacking German positions, dispelling the notion that they were ill-prepared. On the first day of the dig, Richard's team starts to look for evidence of one of the German frontline trenches marked on the map.
We're looking for a machine gun position. It's marked, helpfully, MG on the map. Already we're finding lots and lots of traces of the architecture of the trench, and this is just stripping the topsoil off.
Richard finds a post from which barbed wire would have been hung, cleverly designed so it could be put into the ground without making a noise.
If you're putting a barbed wire fence into no man's land, you're hitting it with a hammer, it's making a big noise, and snipers soon are attracted to that. The way they work out how to deal with that is to put these things in, and this will have a sort of a corkscrew at the bottom, and to put it into the ground you put a stick through this eyelet and then you wind it down into the ground.
And a few metres away they find the barbed wire that it would have supported.
You know, you look at the obstacle of that. Imagine having that in front of the feature you're trying to take. It's a real impediment.
Then, just behind where the barbed wire was found, they discover what they've been looking for: a section of a front-line German trench.
So we're on the German frontline trenches, and we were hoping to find the firing positions. Do you think we've got any evidence of that, Rich?
We've got some really good evidence. We've got what we We've identified now as a fire step. So a fire step is what lets you stand up out of the trench. So when you need to fire, you can get up, you can fire over the top, and then when you finish, you can get down into the relative safety of that extra 1.5 foot worth of soil.
This is clear evidence that the soldiers were training to capture authentically recreated frontline German trenches. But were the fortifications marked on the map behind the front line also built? If they were, it would prove that the soldiers were training not only to attack the front line, but also to fight right through to the rear.
Okay, so we've got this really interesting shelter, and importantly we've got the corrugated iron roof that covered the shelter. We've got this little step here, which is probably some sort of seating arrangement, so that with the roof above, people could sit underneath.
Shelters like these would have offered some protection from the elements, as well as from the shrapnel of artillery bombardments.
Even more interesting is at the very bottom we've got all this trample, which actually shows where the troops would have been walking during the time of using these trenches.
The trample floor isn't the only evidence that these trenches weren't just for show, but were used by large numbers of soldiers.
What we're looking at, is it a latrine or not?
It is a latrine. For you, it's more of a urinal rather than a proper toilet. We know that because of the yellow sandy-like material at the bottom.
That's put very politely.
Richard is now excavating trenches even further back from the front line, and here he finds evidence of how soldiers were trained to continue the battle once the German trenches had been captured.
There's a shelf facing up the hill in each of these little slots. This is as if the British have captured the German trenches and they've worked their way through the German front line, they've got through the reserve and support lines, and then they have to dig in facing the presumed German counterattack from up the hill.
It's evidence that major battle simulations were taking place here. After 2 weeks, they've uncovered an extensive network of trenches, shelters and machine gun positions, a faithful recreation of what soldiers could expect to encounter on battlefields like the Somme.
They utilised the high ground over there, they utilised the high ground in front of me, and the hillside behind me. And this is just the German positions. This is hectares and hectares. It's a vast training landscape.
It's incredible that this map had been lost, and without it we wouldn't have had a clue that so much effort had been made in recreating such an amazingly huge trench system. Richard's discovery on the ground changes World War I history and the view that soldiers were poorly trained before being sent to war.
People that are training through this in 1915 are getting as good an experience as they possibly can. This is the example of generals really trying their very best to give the training required for what's going to happen in 1916, getting away from the idea of these chaps just walking around the parade square with broom handles and then being sent to imminent death on the Battle of the Somme.
Even practicing on Salisbury Plain, trench warfare must have been miserable. So what can archaeology tell us about the men who trained here? Richard has come into the lab to tell me. And you've got some of the artefacts here as well.
Yeah, we do. This is all about morale in many ways. You can be bored in the trenches and wet and miserable, and the one thing you want to do if you're sitting there cold and tired is have a brew. And that tin over there, that's a tin of condensed milk.
Right.
And the soldiers bayoneted it.
Yeah.
You can imagine them sitting there in the trench, need a brew, and you pour the condensed milk in, chuck the tin away, and I think that's lovely. That's all about keeping sane, frankly. The other thing you've got connected with that sort of thing is that thing. I'm really pleased this was empty and we didn't damage it in opening it, because that's a tin of sardines. You can imagine what that would have been like 100 years on if we'd opened it. Yeah. But again, having things like tins of fish, cups of tea, will make these practice trenches not seem quite so bad as they might otherwise. They're not under fire from the Germans here, but nonetheless they've got the same sort of misery of existence, and that's the sort of thing that's critical to get into the training.
And what's this? This has got some writing on it.
You can see Liverpool Reg on it. It's part of the King's Liverpool Regiment. You think of the famous Kitchener poster in 1914, the big recruitment one. It's these guys, recruited in 1914, but we had no idea that they were pretty certainly here, training for what became the Battle of the Somme, and they've left that carving behind.
So they've just carved that in a lump of chalk.
Bored soldier carving their regiment into this thing, and it ends up in the bottom of the trench.
But a fantastic record they were there.
Oh, it's lovely. And we didn't know that. That's why archaeology is brilliant, because that links you to the people, and that's what's so crucial, that you get back to those individual stories of those guys that were here in the First War. After that training experience, they then go through into this very famous first day of the Battle of the Somme, and for them, it goes pretty well. They take relatively... Yeah,
because there are thousands and thousands
famous
of
figure of
casualties.
60,000 casualties on the first day. But for the Liverpool pals, they fight alongside the French on the right-hand side of the British attack, and they take all their objectives and they take relatively few casualties. And that's not the story you get when you think of the Battle of the Somme.
Despite the extensive training that Richard has shown these soldiers received, training wasn't enough. Just a few weeks after their success on the first day of the Somme, the 4,000 eager young volunteers of the Liverpool Pals had received over 1,000 casualties. A shocking 1 in 4.